The question that we are very often confronted with, and the question that you are going to confront when you work on your home assignments, is the question: how do we actually present these findings? How do we write up our results? How do we express those statistics in ways that will be easy to understand? And in order to answer this question, we have this wonderful book, which is called Publication Manual of the American Psychological Association. There are two different editions at present. There is the 6th edition, which was published in 2010, and there is the 7th edition, which was published in 2020, where they made some revisions. So most journals are now using the 7th edition, but in principle, if you're relying on the 6th edition, there are not so many differences. Why do we even care about American Psychological Association? Come on, we are doing our research in Russia or in some other countries, so why do we look at American Psychological Association when we have our own national standards like GOST or Vancouver style or some other standard? The answer is because the American Psychological Association has created a very detailed, helpful, and concise set of guidelines that are helpful for us in preparing publications. And these guidelines are relevant for different social sciences. That's why sometimes sociologists, sometimes economists, sometimes people in other sciences, in education, they use also these guidelines of American Psychological Association, because this is the best, most detailed set of guidelines. And in contrast to GOST or other standards that only set formal things like format of references or margins or headings, the APA publication manual describes much more than that. It describes how do we prepare our publications, the ethical standards, the language that we should use to describe our findings, the punctuation, grammar, the choice of words, how to make good optimal tables, how to create efficient figures, and many other applied questions like this. So it's extremely helpful. That's why even if you're not required to use the standards of the American Publication Association, for example, for your master's dissertation, you can use GOST or APA. It's still a very good idea to use the APA publication manual, because it's a very common format that makes your results presented in such a way that they produce a good impression on the reader. And also, if you want later on to publish your findings, you won't need to reformat your tables and to recalculate your results if some kind of statistic is missing, because most journals use the APA publication manual as a set of guidelines. If you encounter the 6th edition of the APA publication manual and the 7th edition, if you are already familiar with the 6th edition, there are not so many changes. Changes are generally minor, but if you are using some kind of papers for inspiration that were based on the 6th edition, you might see some differences. Basically, the changes in the 7th edition, they improved the situation for us as researchers. First of all, before the situation was very complex for citations. So if you had 5 authors, you had to name them all the first time you cite this paper, but the second time you refer to this paper in the text, you had to place the first author et al. It was extremely confusing. Now they have simplified it. So now if a paper you're referring to has 3 or more authors, you can always refer to it as the first author et al., Pupkin et al., for example. But in the reference list, now you can include all the authors for papers with up to 20 authors. Before it used to be up to 7. Also, the DOIs, digital object identifiers, that we use to refer to papers, instead of referring to a special issue and page numbers, you can just put a DOI. Now you put this DOI as a URL, so it will be clickable when the paper is published. There is no need to give publisher location for books. There is no need to give retrieval date or electronic source for web pages. And there are some guidelines concerning the language. that have changed in the 7th edition. Now, for example, we are recommended to use a single person they instead of saying he or she or s/he for people whose gender can be different. And there are more detailed guidelines on how to avoid labels and bias when we describe people's belonging to different groups and so on. And there are some additional improvements concerning formatting, but most important improvement for us concerns the tables for statistics. In the 7th edition of the APA publication manual, they present a really very helpful set of examples that we'll take a look at shortly. The structure of your empirical report based on the APA publication manual is very clear, very straightforward. So whenever you are describing any kind of empirical study in a research paper, in just an informal report, or in your master's dissertation, you can always use pretty much the same APA type of structure. There is an introduction which gives a theoretical background and which can involve some kind of subsections. There is the methods section or methods chapter in your dissertation, where you need to describe the aim of your study, your sample, your design, your instruments with their psychometric properties, and the procedure that you used for data collection. There is a results section where you just state your results, like the correlation obtained was 0.4, the effect was significant, and so on, but you don't interpret them. You interpret them in the following discussion section, where you try to reflect on why do you get these results, how do they compare to other findings, what are the limitations, what are the possibilities of applying these findings, and so on. So if you have this structure in your head, it will be very easy for you to structure your presentation. And in really bad papers, in some Russian journals, you can see papers that are extremely disorganized. People start with some kind of theories and they present some results, and it's not clear what their sample even was. Extremely confusing. Sometimes people mix results with discussion, and it's also not a very good idea. It produces a bad impression. So I totally recommend to separate results from discussion. And also APA describes how to structure paper if you have several empirical studies, like a pilot study 1 and a main study 2, for example. So you can just give for each study results and discussion together, or you can give just results for each study and a general discussion at the end. So it's again up to you. But the methods for each study will be different, and there will be a common introduction. So if you have this structure in your head, it will be much easier for you to structure your research report. And also, the APA describes typical format of tables that we can use for different empirical methods. The general format of a table according to the APA publication manual is like this. This table has no vertical lines, absolutely. The only horizontal lines that this table has separate important sections of this table, like the heading or some kind of part of this table, or some kind of total, for example. Yeah, so these are the additional properties of this table. So in general, if your table looks like this, it looks neat, it's easy to read, and it produces a good impression. That's why we recommend you to use the APA style for your research reports, wherever you create them. And for different empirical methods, the APA publication manual suggests typical design of tables. So for example, for the t-test, you have 2 groups, and you're comparing these groups on 3 variables. So for each of these groups, for each variable, you give mean and standard deviation, and for each comparison, you give a t statistic. The number of degrees of freedom is given here in parentheses, because it's the same for all comparisons. And exact significance and Cohen's d. So here it's huge, and here it's fairly small. Or a sample correlation table. If you don't know how to present your correlations, here is what you can do. You can give your descriptive statistics and your Cronbach's alphas if you wish, in the same table or in a separate one, but your correlation table is always a lower triangular matrix, never the upper triangular matrix. And for each correlation coefficient, you just give the value and significance you set with these little asterisks that correspond to different levels of significance approximately. We are not required to publish exact significance or confidence intervals because this is redundant information. If you know your sample size, you can always recover it, and so on. For other analysis like regression or factor analysis, the APA also provides standard formats of those tables. The question is, how can we create those tables? And the answer is a bit tricky. In SPSS, it's very painful. SPSS is not going to give you APA formatted tables because it was not made for psychologists. There are ways of forcing SPSS to produce tables in APA kind of design. For example, to remove all the horizontal lines and so on. So here on this website called statsmakemecry.com, you can see a set of guidelines that you can use to actually make SPSS produce tables that will look similar to the APA style. But what is contained in the columns obviously cannot be changed. So the content will still be not what we want. In R, there is a package which is called APA tables, which was extremely promising at the beginning, but then I'm not sure if it's even being developed. It can produce standard types of tables for correlation analysis and regression and for something else, but not for other analysis. So if you want a standard table for a factor analysis, APA tables will not help you. You will need to make it by hand. Luckily for us, a wonderful statistical package called Jamovi. Why is it wonderful? First of all, because it's completely free. It's based on R, but in order to use it, you don't need to know R because it was created with a graphic interface, and the interface kind of follows SPSS. So if you're familiar with SPSS, you can very easily switch to using Jamovi. You will instantly recognize all the dialog boxes and all the approaches. But the good news for us is that Jamovi was created by social science researchers and for social science researchers, and it uses the American Psychological Association format as a standard format for all of its tables. That's why when I do my own analysis for a paper that I want to publish and I don't want to spend much time reformatting these tables, I just use Jamovi. It's quicker than using raw R, and it's quicker than using SPSS because SPSS will give you tables that you will need to spend a lot of time reformatting. That's why I totally encourage you to try Jamovi. Initially, it was very limited in its functionality, but now it has very many add-on modules that you can install from its library that can do a lot of stuff, like confirmatory factor analysis, cluster analysis, and so on, many different types of analysis. So it's improving in its functionality, and even structural equation modeling it can do. So Jamovi is a great tool. To conclude this brief discussion of data presentation, what's important, and these are the guidelines that you can use when you work on your homework number 2. Describe everything that you do with your data. If you excluded some outliers or you applied some transformations, you always need to mention it, because the person who is reading your research report needs to be able to reproduce exactly the results that you got by following exactly the same steps. That's why it's very important to give a description of the steps that you did in detail. It makes sense to give also effect sizes. An effect size is a must-have in any research report because it's the most important results. And as a suggestion, it makes sense to use these common APA formats for your tables and common formats for your graphs. Try not to overload your research report. Try to present the most important findings to make an integral and coherent story. We often want to squeeze everything, all the analysis, into our paper. It's often a bad idea because reviewers and readers get lost and they cannot make sense of it. So that's why many journals now allow you to include supplemental materials that are not part of your paper, but they are published on the website. So if you have conducted some additional very interesting analysis with your data, you can report them in supplemental materials. And there you are not limited in length. You can present basically as many as you want. And people who are really interested, you can mention in your paper that these analyses are reported in supplemental materials, and they can always check them out. Okay, so these are just some suggestions concerning the presentation of your findings. And in terms of textbooks for statistics, for English speakers, I recommend Tabachnik and Fiedel or Andy Field. And for Russian speakers, I recommend books by Nasledov or by Krychevets, Raskazova, and Korneev, a wonderful new textbook that is available online for free. It's kind of open source. So thank you for your attention. Hope it was not too much of a brain overload. And for those who are still eager to get some more statistics, there is an additional discussion of dealing with missing data.